Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto awakened the legendary Mokuton as a child? The lost bloodline that everyone thought was extinct part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Minato's hand shook as the ink dripped onto his son's skin, the heated air drying the markings within seconds. Under his heavy white coat was a thin sheen of sweat that seemed to cling relentlessly to him as he moved, barely pausing to wipe his brow as the sweltering heat increased almost beyond endurance. Even from here, the rage of the Kyuubi could be felt, a tangible snarl of hatred that slashed and bit whatever it could find. The red glow of the Bijuu's chakra seeped through the window blinds, striping his desk in thin fingers of red-black, and its flickering light was barely enough to see the design spiraling out over the infant's stomach. But it was done now, a trap of flesh and ink that would hold the most powerful being the world had ever known. Gently, he lifted the baby into his arms, ink splattering against wood as he let the brush tumble onto his desk. Before beginning his work, he had applied a genjutsu to the child to ensure he would sleep through the procedure, but Naruto had been awake long enough for his father to glimpse his startling blue eyes. Kushina had hoped that he would have those eyes. In fact, she'd loudly voiced her desire for their child to have all of his looks, if only so that he could inherit her sense of humor. Minato had wished otherwise. He felt any child of theirs would be far better off with at least some appearance inherited from their mother, but now he could only be glad of the resemblance. Perhaps it would make it easier for the village to treat Naruto as the hero he was if they could be reminded of who had made him into such. He would not fool himself into thinking that it would be an easy path. He had fought the Jinchuriki of Suna and Iwa in the war. He knew how most villages treated them, and yet, he knew he had to make this sacrifice for Konoha. Being a Hokage overruled all other responsibilities, even fatherhood. The Kyuubi's roar ripped through the air, and the reddish glow filtering through the window intensified into the white-hot radiance of a furnace as the beast's chakra surged. Minato shook himself, angered at his hesitation, and started for the door. Every second of delay was more lives lost, more damage to the village he had sworn to protect. His fear, and he was afraid, he would not deny that now, was nothing compared to the suffering his ninja and civilians both were undergoing as they fought or fled the monster. He had prayed, he had prepared, and he was as ready as he would ever be. It was time for him to go and face the Kyuubi. So, still going through with this, Minato didn't bother to turn around. "Hello, Jiraiya-sensei." The Sannin hopped down from the window, the white spikes of his hair drooping in the heat, his face uncharacteristically serious. "You know what this will mean for him, don't you?" Minato straightened his shoulders, jostling Naruto as he did so. The baby slept on, one fat fist curled in Minato's jacket. "I believe in Konoha, sensei. And I believe in Naruto as well. Out of all the children, he is the most suited to bearing the burden of being a Jinchuriki." Jiraiya raised an eyebrow as the sound of the Kyuubi's tails cracked through the air, loud enough to rupture the eardrums of those standing close to it. "You don't think that he'll unlock the Kekkei Genkai, do you? It's been dead for decades, Minato, and the Kyuubi. He doesn't need the full bloodline, sensei. Every senju has shown some aptitude at, if not fully restraining, at least avoiding the attacks of the Bijuu. Remember Tsunade Hime?" Jiraiya winced. Although in later years he had easily boasted of the Sannin's wartime encounter with the Aikibi of Suna, the memory was still one that made him shudder, especially now, when his village faced Shukaku's far stronger counterpart. The host had been bad enough, all sunken eyes and waxy skin, with a drooling mouth and rasping voice that sounded barely human, but the beast itself had been something out of a nightmare. Yet while he had struggled with the scythe-like claws, the howling wind attacks and the ever-present choking sand, Tsunade had avoided most of the Aikibi's strikes as if they were a genin's shuriken, even battering through the rippling shield of sand that had been almost as fast as Minato's own Hiroshin. Whilst others might have put that down to Tsunade's skill as a kunoichi, Jiraiya could still recall how Shukaku had seemed to recoil instinctively from his teammate, how the whipping sands had seemed to grow sluggish as Tsunade darted through them, the shield shattering under her blows like spun glass, none of which could be explained by anything Tsunade had done deliberately. There had been only one explanation Jiraiya could come up with, and that was in the bloodline of his teammate. No senju since the Shodai had been able to wield the Mokuton, but Kekkei Genkai could never fully die out as long as the genes were still present. Dormant, perhaps, lying inactive in the genes for years until someday they were reawakened in a member of the bloodline without explanation, but never fully gone. It seemed possible that Tsunade, carrying the Mokuton in her genes if not able to use it herself, had been able to perform a shadow of what the Shodai's mere presence had been able to do, although that was far from being able to use the actual abilities of her grandfather herself, as so many Senju had longed for. It couldn't be a question of skill, Jiraiya knew that. After all, Tsunade was one of the finest members of the Senju clan, surely qualifying to inherit the bloodline if strength was what was needed. And Minato, as if he knew what his sensei was thinking, the Yondaime smiled bitterly. I know that, legally he's not, and never will be, part of that clan, but he's of their blood, and he's the best person available, to be honest. Jiraiya didn't know what to say. As a ninja, he knew that no person was perfect, that no village could be the paragon of light and goodness they might parade themselves to be, that no clan was beyond reproach, but still, he found himself surprised at the lengths some people would go to maintain those illusions. After all, the patriarchs of respected clans were not supposed to go seeking affections elsewhere when their wives grew too old for them to desire any more. Young, impressionable kunoichi were not supposed to be wooed by said patriarchs and then be tossed aside once the men had had their fun. Those kunoichi weren't meant to end up pregnant and die in childbirth. Their children weren't meant to be tossed into orphanages and forgotten about. And they certainly weren't meant to climb up from unwanted brats to Hokages possibly even more powerful than the Shodai himself. Another roar sounded, rumbling through the air like distant thunder, and Minato smiled sadly. I have to go, sensei. But, promise me you'll look after him, won't you? Jiraiya took a deep breath. No, he wanted to say. No, I'm not cut out for raising a kid, I want to find out who's responsible for this, I have to see to the village first. I can't take a kid on the run with me, I won't settle down in the village again, not after this. But Minato was staring at him pleadingly, needing the reassurance. Yes, Jiraiya lied, I promise. The Sandaime had not been happy to come out of retirement to serve again as Konoha's leader. Even if the village had not been half destroyed, with the survivors stricken with grief and the other villages prowling around like wolves, ready to feast on the remains, he was an old man and the burden of ruling was not one he was eager to rest on his aged shoulders. Still, he knew his duty and was quick to set about restoring order and dealing with the numerous problems that had been left to him by the Yondaime, with one problem in particular becoming a noticeable thorn in his side. Minato's instructions before he went to his death had been clear. The defeat of the Kyuubi could not have happened without the use of a sacrifice to forever restrain the Biju, and the baby he had used for this purpose was to be honored by the village as much as the man who had given his soul to the Shinigami to ensure the end of the attack. But the village was grieving, still seething with impotent rage against the being that had nearly wiped them out completely, and with no other target for their anger, the hate for the creature seemed to have been transferred to the child that held it. In Suna or Kiri, this hate might have been dealt out in physical attacks, even attempted assassinations, although, with their Jinchuriki power steadily eclipsing even their cages, it would seem that Kurigakure was beginning to regret the attacks that had honed the Sanbi's host into the vicious creature that some said could take control of their village. Konoha did not go such a route, although the Sandaime had guards posted around Naruto for several months after his birth, just in case. Instead, there was a cold, disdainful loathing of him that seemed to have permeated most of the village, with most apparently preferring to pretend he did not exist at all. Keen to avoid things deteriorating further, the Sandaime had Naruto relocating to an orphanage, one of the many that had sprung up or expanded in the wake of the Kyuubi's attack. The staff were loyal, with most fond of the children in their care, but there was a limit to how much they were prepared to show the vessel of the creature that would have destroyed them all if the Yondaime hadn't given his own life to stop it. Aside from feeding and changing the boy, they interacted with him as little as possible, rarely speaking of him even to each other. Which was possibly why none of them were able to acknowledge the strange things that kept happening around him. At first, it was little things, irritating but easy to ignore. Papers rattled on clipboards when people walked past his cot, edges curling towards him as flowers to the sun until they were batted down by annoyed hands. The cot he was placed in was replaced after a few short weeks, its wood seeming to have bent and warped over time, until the formerly solid structure had curved inwards, splintering and cracking into arms that cradled the baby. This was blamed on the damp and a new plastic crib duly arrived, while an unlucky staff member scrubbed the floors and walls for hours in search of wet rot. The flowers scattered in the grass outside began to move up the walls, blooms of white and green and purple sprouting through the threaded cracks in the sun-baked wood. Again, the staff came, and plucked them out, and none of them mentioned how the plants had seemed to strain towards the window where the child none spoke of slept. By the time Naruto was 6, his presence was becoming increasingly harder to ignore, namely because he went out of his way to make sure this was so. No longer content to stay quietly in his room, he pestered the staff constantly, tried to butt into the games of the other children until he was firmly shooed away, pulled pranks that caught far of the adults than they were willing to admit, made a mess of his room when shut up in it, and overall behaved like an unholy terror. The only time he was quiet was when let out to play in the grass behind the orphanage. Overgrown and sloping downwards into a tangled thicket of trees, it was forbidden to the other children, but everyone seemed willing to let Naruto head outside if only it would keep him quiet. There were dangers, of course, forgotten traps and slumbering snakes, poisonous berries and sharp stones. Yet somehow none of these seemed to touch Naruto, who would always tumble back into bed at late hours, filthy and tired but always happy. This was enough for the staff, who never bothered to watch him play, and so never saw exactly what he did whilst playing, nor any of the other dangers that might be lurking. Uchiha Sensei was going to die tonight. He didn't mind the thought. It had been months since the medic nins delivered the grim news, months since the cancerous growths had unfurled in his lungs like poisonous flowers, months since his strength had began to sap as the aches and fatigue sank their teeth into his bones. He was fading, slowly but surely, and had long thought about making a more painless end himself. It was then that he had received some quiet messages, passed along through a chain of trusted individuals that led, well. Sensei had never spoken to them face to face, but such actions could only be sanctioned by the highest command within the Uchiha clan. It was they that had suggested this idea to him, this final use of a life that was guttering out in an ignoble end unworthy of a high-ranking chunin. The Uchiha had been downtrodden for too long, denied the glory that should have been theirs from the very founding of Konohagakure. Soon, they would follow the path that Madara-sama had laid down for them, and strike at the heart of Konoha, cleansing and restoring it to what it should have been, what their clan had laid their lives down for in those early days when war raged and there had been no villages at all. But first, changes would have to be made, with the Uchiha chipping away at the remnants of the old times, piece by piece. If they were going to ensure their success, they would have to make sure that there were no surprises in store when they made their move. Every action would have to be carried out with full knowledge of what lay ahead. And what could be more uncertain, more chaotic, more wild in its fortunes than the Kyuubi that crouched in their village in the form of a child? The Uchiha had lost kin to the Kyuubi, as had all other clans, and their hate for the creature had burned in there long after the tempers of the other Konoha nins had began to cool. But they had not acted rashly. They had listened to their clan elders, and those elders had looked to the Sandaime. When he said no to their vengeance, they had sheathed their hate, even as their fingers twitched towards their kunai whenever the beast ran by. But times had changed, and the elders would no longer let themselves be leashed by those who yet stood in their rightful place. The Kyuubi was a wild card, and the mask of an innocent it wore did not fool for a second those who were born to see through deception. It had power still, and who knew if the Sandaime would unleash that if sufficiently threatened? No, the Jinchuriki had to go. And, if he could offer nothing else, Sensei was sure that even his failing body would be able to overpower the Kyuubi's present, weakened form. It would be a suicide mission, obviously. Even if the Kyuubi did not wound him in its bid to protect itself, Anbu would quickly track down the man responsible for the death of their weapon, and they would be sure to find out where he got the idea from. Sensei did not fool himself about his ability to withstand the attentions of Morino Ibiki. He had concealed a poison capsule on his person. One way or the other, this was the end, and a far better one than what his illness would offer. Naruto laughed as he plonked himself down on the soft, loamy earth, his back to one of the massive trees that seemed to be everywhere around here. Amy, one of the girls at the orphanage, wouldn't even go near the back of the building cause she was afraid the trees were going to gobble her up. Naruto thought that that was the most stupid thing ever. Trees didn't have mouths, so they couldn't eat people, and even if they did, the trees were too awesome to want someone as yucky as her. And had told her so, but all that got him was a telling off while Amy laughed at him and asked why he didn't just go and live in the dirt, like the trees did. He'd gotten Amy back though. There was a tin of paint above her door right now, and she'd be splattered bright green as she opened it. Only that would get another grown-up yelling at him, so Naruto had gone out here to hide. It was getting dark, but he didn't mind. He'd been out here loads of times by himself, and he didn't need anyone to look after him like the other kids did. It didn't even matter that none of them would care anyway. Naruto scowled to himself, kicking his feet against the grass, pine needles bristling against his bare feet. In the distance, he could hear the chirp of bugs, and he squinted his eyes to see if he could spot any by him. No luck, but there were plants, lots of them, bright flowers and spiky weeds and gnarly trees all pushing through the thick carpet of grass. Naruto flicked a short yellow flower, breathing in the sticky sweet smell that was always hanging around the Yamanaka shop. The flowers here are better, he told the clearing, and it seemed as though all the leaves around him were rustling in agreement. He nodded to himself, using one of the bulging roots of the tree to push himself to his feet. Yeah, he didn't even want anyone out here with him, really. He had loads of fun on his own, even if the plants could get sort of weird out here. One time, he fell into a bush, and got so tangled up in it he couldn't get out for an hour. It was almost like it was clinging to him. Another time, he fell asleep in a bunch of flowers, and when he woke up, he was almost completely buried in them. His nose tickled until he nearly sneezed his head off. He felt sort of mean about crushing them, but that meant he'd had to carefully pick them off one by one and it took hours. At least you're not silly like that, he told the pine behind him, patting its mottled white bark encouragingly. He never got problems like that with big trees like this, maybe because they were grown-up trees. This one was over 60 years old. Some of the other trees were even older, but none of the other kids believed him when he said that, just because he couldn't prove it. He just knew these things about the trees, in the same way he knew he had a tongue and 10 toes. Even worse, when someone asked Mrs. Akachi, the head of the orphanage, she said it was true, and some of the trees had been there since before the Shodai founded Konoha. Even then, everyone said that he had gotten it out of a book, and didn't believe him when he said he didn't need a stupid book to know about that. So preoccupied was Naruto in thinking about the unfairness of it all that he didn't even notice the ninja slinking through the trees, spinning red eyes fixed solely upon him. Senzai had been careful to present an ordinary front as he walked through the village, the golden streets warm and welcoming in the late evening glow. He smiled at passers-by, nodded politely at the familiar faces he saw, even chatted with a few, although most of his acquaintances wrinkled their nose when they caught the stench of alcohol on him. He had spent most of the day sitting in bars, looking morose as he ordered drink after drink, drumming his fingers in an endless beat against the polished tables. His wife Sayuri, and it was strange, how even now he felt an ache at the thought of her, had perished in the Kyuubi attack. Everyone would think that this had been a drunken attempt at revenge, not a planned assassination. Even if some suspected, why would they bother to investigate the death of the monster that had killed so many? And perhaps it would be cathartic. Part of him had admitted to himself as he stared down into the amber liquid he'd nursed for hours, to be the one to banish Sayuri's killer into the next world, for however brief a time. Would the beast scream as he sliced its throat, let itself slip back into the monstrous form that was its true face as it died? Senzai didn't know, but oh, how his pulse quickened at the thought he would soon find out. Eventually, he had peeled away from the hustle of the main street and slipped into the shadows provided by crooked roofs and the waning sunlight. Whoever had set this private mission within the clan had done their homework. He knew both which orphanage the demon had been placed in and where exactly it was located. He ducked down a side street, crossed over the Nakano River upon a bridge that echoed even the lightest of footsteps, listening to the dank black water lapping at the railings with a sense of resigned finality. In the distance, he could see the short, box-like structure that had been the Kyuubi's home for the last 5 years. Closing his eyes, he fanned out his senses, trying to detect the overpowering chakra that even a human form could not hide. To his annoyance, he could find no sign of it within the building itself, but a wider search caught the faintest flicker of a trail, leading away into the small forest that lurked at the back. While puzzled at how faded it seemed to be, the Kyuubi's chakra ought to blaze as bright as the sun, not be as soft and light as the chakra of, well, a tree. He followed it in, teeth bared in a grin as he drew closer to his target. The demon was lurking in the very heart of the forest, where the sharp-smelling pines drew close together and scant light filtered through the dense canopy of needle-like leaves. Its bright gold hair was a painted target against the dark, its body crouched against the ground as it peered at the coiled roots of a tree. His breath shuddering in his glutted lungs, Sanzai plucked a shuriken from his pouch and, with a practiced flick of his wrist, sent it whistling through the air towards its mark. Just as the child looked up, a thick branch drooped in front of it, splinters of pale bark flying as the steel tips cracked home. The vessel let out a gasp, eyes darting around as they sought the attacker. When it finally saw him, rising out of the grass, it let out a shout of outrage, putting its hands on its hips. "Hey, you jerk, watch where you're throwing that." Senzai didn't deign to reply, instead pulling a kunai from his belt. His hand was shaking slightly, but no matter, this would all be over soon. He saw the child's eyes widen as it took in the blade, heard it stammer out a new demand for answers with quavering bravado, but it all seemed strangely distant beneath the thrill of this snatch of glory for the Uchiha. He took a step forward, relishing the way the child flinched against the trunk of the tree as he raised the kunai. Felt the sudden rush of chakra through the air, heard a snap and a wet creak as the shadows moved and the moon was blotted out against a rush of rustling black. And then there was only the screams. Hiyami shifted her weight on the branch, wincing as she peered over the edge of it to see the shattering drop below. It was old, this forest, and the trees were enormous, tall and thick enough to blot out her house 20 times over. Chakra hummed over the soles of her feet, anchoring her into place, but from way up here, that wasn't very comforting. Her small, skinny frame that was still awaiting the growth spurt enjoyed by everyone else her age seemed especially fragile against the thick boughs, like an ant clinging to a twig. If she fell, it would be a long way down. Cautiously, she leant forward, trying to see if the blasted animal was anywhere below her. No such luck. The taller, thicker trees around them blotted out most of the light, letting only a greenish hue filter through. The ghastly light made Kiyomi feel as if she was underwater, and it wasn't enough to make out her teammate below her, never mind a speeding hell beast. Releasing the chakra under her feet, she dropped from the branch, knees bracing to take the impact as she landed in the springy grass in front of her teammate. "I can't see it anywhere." Yuki nodded, looking entirely disinterested as she turned to regard the trees around them. It was utterly silent, eerily so, with not a birdsong or breeze to disturb the area around them, and Yuki herself made no sound as she ghosted over the slimed pine needles beneath their feet. Hiyami could only watch her in envy. The noise she'd made blundering through the forest had probably been what startled the wretched cat away in the first place. True, she'd been practically silent by civilian standards, but there was a wide range between civilian and shinobi standards, and Tora was practically a B-rank ninja in his own right, judging by the amount of times he escaped the daimyo's wife. "We'll have to search the entire forest if we hope to find him. The daimyo's wife must return to her estates by tomorrow, and she wants Tora back by then." Hiyami, who had been busy dusting off her scraped hands, looked up in disbelief. "You know, we'd find him a lot quicker if you'd use your bloody Byakugan." Yuki sniffed in disdain, leaving not a leaf disturbed as she swept over the forest floor. "Quicker, perhaps, but I have no desire to experience another headache. I have been using it all day. It was less than 5 hours. I know you're not that good at it, but can't you?" Yuki paused, her dark hair silvered in the moonlight as she turned her blank white eyes on her teammate. When her voice came, it was colder than the snow she was named for. "I've used it enough today. Awaken your own bloodline first before you start telling me how to use mine." A poisonous retort flew to Kiyomi's lips, and it was only with the greatest effort that she tampered it down. Jin-sensei had already lectured her enough about her inability to get on with Kagawa. She didn't need problems with Yuki too. She forced out a laugh instead, even as her hands darted to her eyes, the eyes she knew would be utterly black in the dim light, without so much as a flicker of a Sharingan to brighten them. "Don't worry, my aunt's already on my case about it. You're right. I can't even work my own bloodline, I shouldn't judge." She'd meant for it to sound lighthearted, but even she could hear the bitterness seeping into the words. Yuki obviously heard it too, judging by the awkward look she gave Kiyomi, and her own nervous gesture towards the headband that covered the poisonous green design on her pale skin. There were few that knew better about the downsides of being in a clan than the branch Hyuga, and Yuki's own weak Byakugan range had to needle her as sorely as Kiyomi's lack of the Sharingan. The return to normal conversation was the closest they'd ever get to apologizing. Yuki's voice was soft as she replied, "Well, I suppose it doesn't matter. We couldn't catch him with all three of us here in the daylight. I suppose we'll just have to wait until he gets tired." Kiyomi nodded, wincing as she ran a hand through her mane of wild black hair. It had looked halfway decent in the morning, but an hour of tracking Tora through the trees had left it tangled and sticky with sap from where she'd blundered into a particularly nasty thicket. Yuki's hair, of course, was still in its elaborately coiled play, the faint starlight glinting off her jeweled hair pins and the mirror-bright shine of her headband, her kimono as pristinely white as when she'd put it on this morning. Kiyomi would never admit it, but she'd kill to have just half of Yuki's grace and delicacy, even if her teammate was an arrogant cow most of the time. Yuki glanced up at the sky as they walked, which was rapidly lightening to the red-pink of salmon flesh. "If we want to get it back by daybreak, we need to hurry." Kiyomi raised an eyebrow, carefully skirting a suspicious-looking burrow. "If you have any suggestions, I'm all ears." Yuki considered. "We could try laying bait. We tried that before. It didn't work. Well, in retrospect, perhaps it wasn't a good idea to let Kagawa handle the fish." "Not a good idea. His dog ate them, and then vomited everywhere." Yuki let out a sigh of irritation, carefully ducking under an overhanging branch. The trees seemed to thicker here, pressing closer and closer to the narrow path they'd been sticking to. "Well, put it this way. At least we know another weakness of the Inuzuka now, weaknesses that we can use against him when we spar next." "Are you going to fight Setsuna and Kagawa with fish?" Yuki frowned, and Kiyomi remembered belatedly how she hated being made fun of. "Well, if you have any." A scream split the air, low and agonized as it tore towards them. The two girls froze, and another cry came, the scream of a man in utter terror and pain, until, suddenly, it was cut off in an awful finality. Her heart thudding in her chest, Kiyomi's hand darted to the sword at her side, but Yuki was faster. Her hands flying into seals, she faced the direction of the scream with a look of grim determination. Byakugan. A spiderweb of veins bulged around her eyes, and Kiyomi tensed, already drawing her sword. "What is it? What's happened?" But Yuki only stared ahead in horror, her mouth gaped open in an almost comical display of shock. Any other time, Kiyomi might have found her expression hilarious, but here, in the forest of screams, it chilled her to the bone. She grabbed Yuki's arm with her spare hand, shaking her when she received no reaction. "What is it?" "It's..." Yuki's voice trembled, and she turned a look of horrified disbelief to Kiyomi. "It's a child. There's a hurt kid." She needed no further answers. Letting go of Yuki, Kiyomi turned and raced for the source of the screams, realizing with a sickening jolt that she could smell blood as she flung herself through the trees. If making her way through the forest had been difficult before, it was nearly impossible now. Weaves of vines, thorny and tangled, lashed her even as she tried to duck underneath them. The path narrowed further and disappeared completely against the thicket of trees, and the sharp-scented leaves thickened and spread until she was using her ears and not her eyes to fight her way through the mesh of woods. She could hear something as she struggled, a faint, gasping sobbing, a whimper that was more like that of a wounded animal than a human child. Awful as it was to listen to, the sound gave Kiyomi hope. If they were still conscious, if they could make a noise, they might not be too badly injured to be moved. If she and Yuki could only be quick enough, they could find them, get them back to the village before the guards changed, and take them to the hospital. Careful as she was, she almost missed the kid, only the faintest flash of gold catching her eye. She ducked again, wincing as a particularly spiky bough tugged at her hair, and then, there he was. The kid, a boy, someone's little boy, sat curled in the hollow of an enormous pine tree, the largest that Kiyomi had ever seen. Its bark, a startling white, seemed to curve almost protectively around the kid, the large fissure that sheltered him a rippled red-black, oozing with a dark, thick sap apart from a small patch of white that was probably a bit of moss. Sending a silent prayer of thanks, Kiyomi dropped to her knees, reaching out towards him as he sobbed quietly into his knees. "Hey, are you okay? Don't worry, everything's fine, we've come to." At the sound of her voice, his head snapped out, and Kiyomi found herself staring into a pair of wide, terrified blue eyes. With a muffled shriek, the boy scrambled further back into the tree, and as Kiyomi tried to reach out, her hand snagged on a spiked weed that suddenly twisted out of nowhere. She let out a pained yelp, wincing as she felt the scratch and the warm wetness of her blood. The boy poked his head out, and to Kiyomi's bewilderment, she saw that there were more vines draped around his limbs. And where had they come from, in this tangled thicket of trees? Only, they weren't sticking to him. They were moving, rearing up to face her like a Suna cobra. Don't come near me. Kiyomi held up her hands, hoping he couldn't see the blood trickling over her palm. The kid was obviously scared, and hurt, if the stench of blood was any indication. She had to get him back to Konoha, and soon, but it was going to be difficult if he was too petrified to come. Softening her voice as much as she could, she extended a hand, watching as the vines stiffened around him in their parody of an embrace. And what the hell was happening, that the ordinary plants she'd always known were acting like that? My name's Uchiha Kiyomi. I'm a genin from Konoha. You're from there as well, right? He stared at her for a long moment, while the leaves around her rustled in warning. She tried to keep the warm smile on her face, and he gave a barely perceptible nod. Kiyomi took that as a good sign. What's your name? For a moment, it seemed as if he wouldn't answer. Then, Uzumaki Naruto. Kiyomi stiffened. She had heard that name before, usually followed by a round of cursing. As best as she could tell, the adults all disliked him for something, but they would never explain what, only that she should stay away from him. Kiyomi had never been given a personal reason to dislike the kid. Hell, she hadn't even seen him before, but she normally tried to be an obedient niece, and so had stayed away. But this was different. He was obviously nothing more than a scared child, one that needed help, and she wasn't going to leave him here for a reason that no one would explain. Naruto. Huh, that's a nice name. He stared at her, looking disbelieving. Huh, yup, it's more interesting than mine. A bit weird, being named after a ramen topping, but maybe his parents had been big fans of the stuff. Like I said, Naruto, I'm a genin. She gave the band knotted around her arm a tap, and his gaze flickered quickly over it, and I can bring you back to the village. I'm sure your parents, did he have any? Kiyomi could not recall hearing about any other Uzumakis, and what sort of parent would have let their kid wander around in the forest in the dead of night. However, she could remember hearing her aunt complain about the Sandaime being a soft touch on that awful, filthy child. Perhaps the two knew each other. The Hokage. She tried again, feeling hopeful at the look of the recognition in Naruto's eyes. My friend and I will take you back to the Hokage. He'll make sure you're safe, okay? The child seemed to consider this. Really? Kiyomi nodded, holding out her arms. Really? But first, you're going to have to let me help you. She eyed the vines, and felt profoundly disturbed as they, with a palpable look of reluctance, withdrew from the kid, their thorns scraping against the bark of the tree. Can you come out? Slowly, Naruto crawled forward, and she leaned forward, ready to lift him up. To her bewilderment, he collapsed against her instead, his eyes falling shut. Kiyomi carefully lifted him up into an awkward carry, settling him against her hip like she had seen some Uchiha mothers carrying their own children. She didn't know how old he was, 4, 5, but he was lighter than she'd expected, and she was pretty sure she could carry him back to the gates at least. Kiyomi. The Uchiha looked up to see Yuki appear in the clearing, her chest heaving as she stared down at Kiyomi with wild white eyes. Kiyomi glared at her, trying to shift Naruto in a more comfortable position. It was hardly pleasant, finding a child lost alone in the woods, but she didn't see what Yuki had found so terrible about it. At least the kid was safe now. About time you showed up. We need to go, he just fell asleep. I don't know what's wrong with him. Kiyomi. Yuki's voice volume had lowered considerably, but it was trembling still, and Kiyomi could detect the panic that was threatening to overwhelm the Hyuga. Put him down. Kiyomi stared at her, hardly able to believe her ears. She knew that people disliked the kid, and perhaps she normally wouldn't be around him, but what cause had Yuki to look at him with such, well, fear? Had she even met him before? Excuse me, look at him. He's exhausted, he's asleep, he's probably got hypothermia. We need to get him back. The kami know what's happened to him. I think I know what's happened, said Yuki, and she stepped close enough for Kiyomi to see the fear in her pale eyes. Kiyomi, Turn around, and look at what he's done. Startled, Kiyomi twisted around, staring at the tree behind her. It stood motionless, bark red and sticky with sap, apart from that one patch of white that Kiyomi had assumed was moss. Slowly, she drew closer, scarcely able to believe her eyes as the object finally came into focus and she saw what the tree was hiding. It was a hand, a human hand, jutting from the tree, and the blood dripped thick and black from its wrist. Kiyomi staggered back in shock, and then it was Yuki's turn to move forward, Yuki to prise at the bark, until it came away red and dripping to reveal the crushed, distended face of what had once been a man, the red ruin of his mouth fixed open forever in a final, silent scream. Doing her best to stay calm, Yuki carefully dropped the bark she had just wrenched from the tree, shuddering as she looked at the sticky red residue it had left on her fingers. Kiyomi stayed where she was, staring up at the body in the tree with an expression blank with shock, while her arms still cradled the child that had caused it. Yuki stared at him, remembering where she had seen him before. It was Uzumaki Naruto, the prankster, the troublemaker, the one every parent told their child to stay away from. No Hyuga would have dreamed of associating with him. Too poor, too grubby, too bent on chaos, and Yuki's clan had specifically warned her that the child was not to be trusted. How many times had Yuki, passing by on missions or free time, seen the child race laughing through the village, followed by an enraged victim of his pranks, or sitting alone, staring longingly as other children played. A lonely child, perhaps, and for the sake of her clan, Yuki had squashed any sympathy that began to emerge from that, and not one to be seen with, but, his pranks were always annoying but never seemed malicious. Even looking at him now, a small and skinny child with spiky yellow hair and a grubby t-shirt, it seemed almost comical to imagine him being able to swat a fly, never mind actually hurt anything. But Yuki couldn't find anything to laugh about now. I know him, Kiyomi croaked at last, the pallor on her face matching that of the corpse in the tree. It was a man, with graying hair and bulging eyes still tinted red from his now inert Sharingan, mouth and nostrils wet with blood, his features twisted grotesquely by that last, frozen scream. His distorted face looked barely human, never mind someone Yuki could recognize, but Kiyomi's face had drained to the color of soured milk as she stared up at him. That's Senzai, Officer Senzai, he was a friend of my uncle, he works in the police. She stopped, apparently beginning to register exactly what this meant, that this was someone she knew, someone who had died horribly and for a reason that neither of the two wanted to think about, and turned away, looking violently ill. Yuki couldn't blame her. She was fighting the urge to be sick herself, but she tried to push aside her own shock, tried to think properly. That was what they had praised her for in the academy, even above the taijutsu skills that were her birthright as a Hyuga. She viewed things in a clinical manner, she mapped out scenarios and followed the rules they set up. Her Byakugan was weak, she could admit that if only to herself, and where taijutsu had failed her, she turned to her brain and tried to work with that instead. It hadn't helped her with making friends, even with her prestigious clan name behind her, and that was why they'd thrown her on a team with Kiyomi whom she'd known since they were crawling around in that old nursery together, Kiyomi who was as bad with the Uchiha's prized genjutsu as Yuki was with her clan's taijutsu style, a disgrace to her clan's name, who wielded a sword and spat fire jutsu but had no Sharingan of her own, the one person that didn't try to force Yuki into the mold of the flawless Hyuga she should be. Kiyomi was the closest thing that Yuki had ever had to a friend, and words hadn't been able to describe the sickening lurch of fear Yuki had felt when she saw who she was carrying and just what he had done. The Byakugan, her greatest asset, and in some ways, her ultimate curse, because it was her Kekkei Genkai that gave the Hyuga the right to brand her with the curse mark and condemn her to a lifetime of servitude, had seen the buried corpse right away, seen the body that was even now mostly hidden in the heart of the tree, seen the crushed bones, the pulped flesh, seen the blood pooling at the roots of the tree. It had seen the child cowering at the foot of the tree, seen the blood soaking him despite the absence of any wounds, seen her teammate rush towards him without any idea of what she was heading to. But that was not all they had seen. There was chakra lingering in the tree, chakra that blazed bright and blue, the same chakra running through the coils of the child in Kiyomi's arms, mingling with the pale yellow-green chakra that had sustained the tree from the moment it began life. And what it had done with that boost of chakra. There were roots coiled around the remains of the Uchiha's arms and legs, and just through tracing the lingering remains of the chakra in the air, Yuki could figure out what had happened. The man had been yanked into the very heart of the tree, and enfolded over by the trunk, the red ruin of his flesh lanced through and drawn up, leached of all it contained until there was only a pink-white mess to stain the hollowed-out black. He had been utterly devoured, and by a tree that had cradled a small child in its roots, the bright blood of the Uchiha staining his golden hair. Yuki didn't know of any jutsu that could do that, and Uzumaki was a clanless orphan according to the older branch members who had swiftly cut off any other questions about the strange child, even the queries of the clan heiress. There was no way that he should have been able to get access to jutsu that were strong enough to destroy an adult like that, never mind a full-grown Uchiha, and Yuki didn't even want to think about what the man had been doing with the child in a forest in the middle of the night in the first place. She didn't know if Uzumaki had parents, but surely there were guardians, someone to care for him and to keep him from being in such areas. If this hadn't been a deliberate attack, then perhaps it had been an accident, a lashing out of power that couldn't be controlled. But that would normally happen only in bloodlines, and the user would have to be in such stress that they instinctively reach for that which they could not handle. But right now, none of that mattered. What did was that Uzumaki, already a suspicious child, was definitely a witness, if not an outright suspect, in the death of an Uchiha, a police officer to boot, and a member of that same prestigious clan happened to be holding him. Even if he was unconscious, Kiyomi could still be in danger from him, and Yuki would not let this child do that same harm to her teammate. Kiyomi, put him down. The Uchiha turned to look at her, but Yuki got the sense that she wasn't really seeing her. The girl's face was completely white, and her eyes were wide, shocked. Only her arms stayed put, still supporting Uzumaki, who looked deceptively innocent, with his golden hair and chubby cheeks, eyes shut as his head lolled against Kiyomi's neck. Her shock was no surprise, even if they had both already had their first kill, on a border patrol over by grass. These kills had been unnatural even by shinobi standards, absolutely horrible, and it had been someone that Kiyomi had known, nothing like the would-be infiltrators that they had killed quickly and quietly and sobbed over for hours afterwards. But they could still be in danger, and they had to do something. Kiyomi shook her head, as if she was trying to shake the scene away. What the, how did this happen? I don't know, Yuki said, swallowing as she deactivated her Byakugan, because even though she was a ninja and a Hyuga, she was also a 12-year-old girl, and the wrecked corpse was far worse than the thieves that had died quickly and cleanly when she tapped their throats. Even without the sight, she could feel nausea bubbling up inside her, the picture of that ruined body refusing to leave her mind. But I know that he's got something to do with it. Put him down, Kiyomi, please. Kiyomi stared in bewilderment at the child in her arms, the blood caked on him drying into brown stains. What, you think that he did this? Yuki, he's just a child. Maybe. Kiyomi shook her head, still cradling the child, obviously trying not to look up. Yuki, you didn't see him. He was terrified. I don't think he could have done that. Yuki wanted to disagree, to tell Kiyomi that it was only logical for him to be terrified after doing something like that, because the repercussions for killing Uchiha, and members of the police no less, were certainly severe, but only shook her head. Let's take him back to the village. The sun had risen, washing the sky in a gentle ripple of gold. Looking at it through the window as he shook his hands out, joints popping and crackling as he stretched them, Sarutobi found it quite pleasing to see. There were few benefits to having to stay up all night to finish paperwork, but the brilliant sunrise would always be one of them. It reminded him of his time as a young man, on missions with Homura and Kaharu, when he kept watch through the night until daybreak. Easier times, perhaps happier ones, but he would not allow himself to be drawn into nostalgia, that oft-sprung trap for the old. Instead, Sarutobi laid down the last of his paperwork with a pleased sigh. At last, after more than 4 hours of non-stop toiling, he had finally finished every last piece, as well as getting through that supremely unnecessary council meeting. Why the Uchiha had to hammer out yet another law for the civilians to obey when there were already too many for even the military police to remember without aid of the Sharingan was beyond the Sandaime. He glanced at the clock on the wall. There was just enough time to have a pleasant smoke before heading to the Hokage mansion and finally getting some sleep. Hokage-sama, Unless the universe decided to once again prove that it genuinely hated all Hokages and interrupt him. Resisting the urge to weep in frustration, Sarutobi looked up. Standing in the doorway was an Anbu, their face covered by an eagle mask. An Uchiha has been murdered, Hokage-sama. Uchiha Sensei, a member of the military police. A flood of ice raced through the Sandame's veins. Tensions had been building over the Uchiha, and talks with them becoming akin to waving flint in front of a powder keg. If one of their own had been taken, and a police officer to boot, it might be enough to provide that fatal spark. Where, and who were the perpetrators? The forest, Hokage-sama. A team has already been sent to retrieve the remains. And, the Anbu paused, and Sarutobi could sense his hesitation. And Uzumaki Naruto was found at the scene of the crime. Sarutobi stared at the Anbu coldly, even as his heart sank. Explain. Chu Genin found him by the base of a tree, frightened and severely depleted of chakra. And, Hokage-sama, the body was found within the tree itself, having been pulled in there after the flora was manipulated by chakra that clearly corresponds to that of Uzumaki. It bears a strong resemblance to Tenzo-san's jutsu. What? There was a few things that Naruto was vaguely aware of as he floated in a sea of white, curled up close into himself. There was an odd knocking sound, rat-a-tat-tat against his ears, the acrid stink of cleaning fluids like they used in the orphanage, an annoying beeping, and, insistently muscling against his thoughts, was a faint tugging, something pulling really hard at his thoughts, until all he could focus on was the sensation of it. It was annoying, and Naruto screwed his eyes shut. He liked it here, in the soft white blankness, where it was warm and safe. He didn't want to leave. Naruto. Part of Naruto wanted to ignore the voice, which seemed kind and sorta familiar, but it seemed too late. The whiteness was disappearing, replaced with the warm darkness of his closed eyelids. He groaned half-heartedly, wishing they could stay closed, but even he knew that now he had to wake up. Slowly, the young boy opened his eyes. He was lying on a narrow bed in a small room with whitewashed walls, and he realized as he looked around that it was probably a hospital of some kind. The beeping noises had come from some monitors that were sitting to one side, flashing red and green lights, while the knocking noise came from a fan in a corner, its constant droning interrupted by its blades rattling against warped metal. A small window was mostly blocked by a withered sunflower in a cheerful yellow pot that was brighter than its petals. Strips of light were plastered to the wall, and they were so bright that Naruto screwed up his eyes as he looked at them. But he didn't look for long, because next to the bed was a chair, and sitting in that was someone Naruto was actually happy to see. Gigi. The old man smiled, though even Naruto could see that it didn't reach his eyes. He was in his long Hokage robes, with his hat perched on his head, and Naruto wondered briefly why he was in the room when the few times Naruto saw him had been in his office. Hello, Naruto. I'm glad to see you're finally awake. I was quite worried about you. Naruto struggled to sit up, feeling confused. Awake? He didn't remember falling asleep. The man walking towards him, his eyes red as blood, kunai flashing through the air, looking for somewhere to run, but there wasn't any and he was coming with a knife. Cornered, with nowhere to go. Praying for something, anything to help. A sudden creaking noise. Blood. Keep you safe, I promise. Falling. Naruto stiffened, his memories clicking into place. He'd killed that guy. I can't have. I didn't mean to. But he had. He had killed him. The tree had. It had done what he'd wanted, what he'd asked, and he didn't know it would happen. But now the old man was going to punish him. Maybe even kill him like he had, and it wasn't his fault and he hadn't meant to do it. A loud rattle cut through his thoughts, and he looked up, confused. The sunflower in the window was swaying, its petals flexing like an open fist, its stalk crackling as it moved, twisting through the air towards him. Before Naruto's bewildered eyes, it draped itself over his shoulder, small brown seeds dusting against his shirt as it rubbed itself against him like a cat. He looked over at the old man for answers, but he just gave a small sigh. I was afraid as much. But do not worry, Naruto. You are not in trouble, for once in your life. Naruto stared at him, shoulders heaving. Gigi, I didn't. I know, the Sandame said as soothingly as he could. I know that you would not have just attacked that man, Naruto. But now, I need you to tell me what happened. Despite the Sandame's best efforts, he had only managed to get bits and pieces of the story from Naruto. However, it was enough for him to pierce the truth together, and thus give him the answers of what to do next. An Anbu materialized with a swirl of leaves next to him as he left the hospital room, the man's porcelain mask not quite hiding the hesitation he clearly felt when confronted with the Sandame's visible anger. "Your will, Hokage-sama." Sarutobi gritted his teeth, fingers flexing as if he wanted to start firing off some of his more damaging jutsus and was managing to abstain only by the skin of his teeth. "Tell Ibiki that his efforts into the Uchiha clan must double. I want to know exactly what Uchiha Sensei's motives might have been and to determine whether he truly was acting alone." "His wife died," the Anbu said quietly. "In the Kyuubi's attack. Surely that was motive enough. Perhaps, or perhaps not. Nonetheless, my orders stand, but be sure to be sensitive. The Uchiha are going to be out for blood over this." "Yes, Hokage-sama." The Sandaime rubbed his face wearily. The attack had been a little too calculated for his liking. Stalking a child through a dark forest wasn't quite the impulsive act of a drunken, desperate man, but nor was it out of the range for a ninja bent on revenge. And they would have to tread carefully as they could around the Uchiha. Fugaku had become increasingly belligerent in council meetings, and Sarutobi did not like the mutterings that were being passed through to him by certain individuals. A false accusation could destroy what little progress had been made on that front. Still, something about it didn't sit quite right with him. He would simply have to rely on Ibiki in this matter, yet there was more that must be done. "I don't want this getting out before it has to. Have the genin who retrieved him sent to my office, and make sure that they understand that they are not to breath a word about this to anyone if they don't want instant demotion. And contact Jiraiya. There is much that we have to discuss." The Anbu disappeared in a swirl of leaves, and the Sandaime closed his eyes. Uzumaki Naruto, the inheritor of the Mokuton. This will be interesting. A storm was coming to Konoha, and its harbinger lay thick in the air, a heavy blanket of humidity that seemed to press down on all those walking the streets in a smothering embrace, prickling the skin into a chill of cold sweat. Few figures were hurrying through the gauze of smoke-gray fog clinging wetly to the cobbles. The weather seemed to carry its own note of warning that kept all but the most urgent business indoors. The Uchiha district was no exception to this. Civilians and shinobi of the clan alike had long since hastened inside their homes, although whether it was the darkening sky that had prompted this or another matter altogether was hard to say. Not hours before, a sudden meeting of the elders had been called, and with it came a sense of panic that had flared through the clan like wildfire, despite the fact that none knew exactly what was being discussed. There was only the sense of inescapable dread that had sent the rest of the Uchiha inside their houses, shutters bolted firmly against the high sharp wind that keened against the wood like a knife scraped over stone, and none would dare to even look at the clan head's house where the elders had been summoned. Although by far the most opulent of the district, the luxury of the house could barely be seen through the gloom of the weather, with barely a flicker of light present behind windows that had been locked and blinds drawn even before the first cloud had been seen on the horizon. The children of the house were both away, and an oppressive silence seemed to reign through the empty rooms, most of which being utterly gloomy without sound or light to cheer them. Yet movement flickered in the study of the clan head. There was a warm light that glowed through the screens of the room as if it were a paper lantern, and with it came the sound of urgent voices. "Told you it would not work. It should have done. Damn Sensei for a fool, if he had only followed instructions. Hold your tongue." Sensei-san knew what had to be done, and he was willing to give his life for the good of the clan. Do not mock his sacrifice. He made it clear that he knew exactly what he had to do and when. We must have been misinformed. The demon must have had guards after all. We were simply not prepared. A crack sounded as a hand was slammed against a table. Then we should have been. This was a vital operation, one that needed every care to be taken, every method available used to ensure its success. Now more than ever must we rely on our own intelligence about the village, now must we use only the strength of our own ninja, and you tell me that the most crucial operation at hand has been blown because no one checked if there were guards. There came the clinking of porcelain against wood, the clearing of a throat. Guards were checked for. Our friends in the Hokage Tower even examined the rota and questioned the secretary through genjutsu. The child has been without guards since the first 3 years of his life. it was the obscurity of the orphanage that the Sandaime relied on to protect him. Something must have gone wrong, but it was not the fault of Senzai or any others who helped to prepare him. And with respect, I would not call it our most crucial operation. Its failure is a disappointment, certainly, but it changes little. There are many points of weakness within the village that can and will be targeted, but many can be dealt with once the main operation has succeeded. I want the demon dead as much as any other, but the threat is not so urgent at this time. The Jinchuriki is still a child that demolished a full-grown Uchiha. If the Sandaime unleashes him, he will not. Sarutobi is a fool, and a soft one besides. He will not use the demon when it hides in a child not even in the academy. Do you not recall how he fought against Itachi's ascension as a ninja? It does not sit well with him to use children in battle, not when he likes to play the part of Konoha's doting grandfather. In war, he will shed their blood freely and not offer a tear, but peace has been his undoing. He will not bring himself to use a child as a weapon. You call that weakness, said a new voice, but the old monkey is cunning. Our clan burns anew where the Senju withered, and Itachi is the brightest flame of all. Sarutobi robs our youth of their glory, presses them down to the level of the other clans, holds them back in the academy when they could be striding forth on the battlefield, bringing honor and fear to the Uchiha name. He cripples us, and we call him blind for doing so. Do not delude yourself. He may cling to peace, but push him and he will unleash a firestorm. The Kyuubi is loyal to him, and he will use it if necessary. Senzai was only the first that will fall to its power. We do not even know how Senzai died. More likely that there was an Anbu lurking to watch over the child and he was dispatched as soon as he moved to slay it. There is no reason to think that it was any action of the Kyuubis that defeated him. We do not even know if the beast can be unleashed. The Yondaime's seal was of his own design, and has not been used before or since. It was a seal of desperation besides, not to craft a weapon. It could well be that the Kyuubi is locked entirely within its prison, and cannot access its old power at all. You can't rely on that. It takes only the smallest amount of chakra for the beast to wield great power. Suna's Jinchuriki is the same age as the brat, and they say the entire village cowers away from him. And that is only the Ikibi, the weakest of the Biju. If one tael's worth of chakra is enough to bring grown ninja to their knees, imagine what the Kyuubi could do. You sound like you envy the beast's power. The speaker sounded amused, ignoring the indignant splutter of the previous man. I for one see no danger. If the vessel was grown, I would agree that it would be in the interests of the clan to remove him before anything further could be done, but as it stands, the Kyuubi is powerless for now and likely to remain that way. The Sandaime was a fool to not utilize him as the other villages did their own Jinchuriki, but his loss is our strength, and I see no reason to defend against what cannot strike at us. Our aim should be on the village itself. Senzai died in the attempt, and did not have the chance to be interrogated, but the Sandaime will be looking for answers. Already, the suspicion is on us. Why should it be? They have no proof of any other involvement. Senzai's wife perished in the attack, of course he would wish to avenge her. Perhaps the whereabouts of the child were not widely known when he was an infant, but any could have followed the brat home and discovered his location. It would not take a conspiracy to be able to attack the vessel. And anyone around the village would be able to tell the Anbu that Senzai spent the day trawling through bars, probably barely able to walk by the end of it. A desperate attempt at revenge whilst under the influence of alcohol. Regrettable, but nothing to do with us. The matter should come to us, anyway, someone snapped. It is a domestic incident. It falls under the purveyance of the police. We have dealt with our own before, they know it is our right. If the Sandaime truly wished for the Uchiha to reconcile with the village, he would give the case to us, not toss it to the Anbu. As if the Sandaime would miss a chance to flaunt his power over us. Have you not seen our records? All the cases are flooding away to his dogs in the Anbu. He means to weaken both our ninja and our prestige while he pretends confusion at our attempts to regain our positions. No, Uzumaki's attack will go to the Anbu, and he will expect us to cooperate, to be as docile as dogs if we don't want to risk his whip. But it doesn't matter. Senzai acted alone, to avenge the loss of his beloved wife. None can prove otherwise. Our hands are clean in this. A murmur of agreement rippled through the air, but one speaker was still unconvinced. Sarutobi will still suspect. He will watch and wait and then. Let him watch. Senzai's failure is unfortunate, but Uzumaki is still a child, and Sarutobi can only grasp at shadows. He is old now, his power waning with every day that passes. Leave the Kyuubi alone for now. Itachi reports nothing new, and all is progressing as it should be. We have better places to focus our strength, and when the time comes, better ninja to wield it. Yuki and Kiyomi's original plan had been to take Naruto straight to the hospital, despite Yuki's assertion that he had no injuries that he could see and was merely suffering from a bad cause of chakra exhaustion. Yuki had received some basic training in the arts of medical ninjutsu. Someone had to patch Kagawa up when the fool blundered into trouble, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be Kiyomi, who was generally responsible for it and knew that there was little that could be done for it other than rest and the avoidance of further jutsus until recovery. However, Naruto clearly needed to be taken care of, and, short of dropping him outside the Hokage's office, they knew of no other place where he could go. The hospital seemed the best choice, although there had been little discussion between the two of them about it. Kiyomi was still shocked into silence by what they had seen. Yuki was too busy thinking about what it had meant. However, upon arriving at the gates and explaining what had happened, things spun out of their control very quickly. They were hastily pulled into the village by the Chunin guards, who demanded explanations while staring with hostile eyes at the child Kiyomi held and how Yuki had bristled at the implications that they were behind Naruto's state. No sooner had they explained what had happened again when an Anbu, their face hidden by a dog mask, showed up and plucked him from Kiyomi's arms, unceremoniously ordering them back to their homes. The guards agreed, telling them that their mission was complete, and shooing them alone as if they were academy students, not fully fledged ninja in their own right, while the Anbu vanished in a swirl of leaves, taking Naruto with him. No sooner had they been ordered to leave, however, when Tora suddenly came sauntering over the gate, apparently bored of his outing into the forest. Barely had the cat had a chance to realize just what a bad place he had picked when Yuki struck, her Byakugan pinpointing the perfect spot for a two-palm strike to Tora's skull. In her frustration, she perhaps might have applied more chakra than was strictly necessary, sending a vicious strike into the brain's tenkatsu that left Tora stunned and his fur faintly smoking. The possibility of brain damage increased each time someone received such a blow to the head, but knowing Tora for as long as she had, Yuki could not of anyone who would notice or care. Kiyomi, still visibly shaken, volunteered to take the cat to the Hokage's office, where it could be returned to the aides of the daimyo's wife. Yuki thought about accompanying her, but eventually decided against it. The excuse she gave to Kiyomi was that she wanted to return home and fall straight asleep, but the truth was that she wanted to think, and somehow, it felt horribly traitorous to Kiyomi to be doing so whilst her teammate walked obliviously next to her. Uzumaki Naruto, a prankster, a troublemaker, a filthy boy with neither name nor family. But a harmless child for all that, and one that Yuki could feel the faintest stirrings of pity for, so clearly bereft was he of anyone to care for him. For all that the adult figures in her life muttered about him, even Sensei's face had been shadowed when Naruto ran by, she had never heard of him doing direct harm to anyone. So one would an Uchiha, a police officer no less, want to kill him? The question plagued Yuki all the way home, but no matter what she thought, she could get no answer that made sense. With the gradually dissolution of the Senju, the Uchiha had become Konoha's most prominent clan, second only to the Hyuga, she added hastily to her thoughts, and they were proud of that legacy. They were quick to anger, and clung to their grievances with the passion of 1,000 flaming suns. Kiyomi still held grudges born in the first year of the academy, but she could not think of any prank Naruto could have pulled, any insult he could have given, to prompt one of them to hunt down a small boy in the middle of the night for slaughter. She had seen the kunai, she had smelt the sickly salt of blood on earth. Uchiha Senzai, Kiyomi's blood kin, had tried to murder a little boy, and the consequences had not even begun to unfold. The sunrise had flushed the sky red and gold by the time Yuki arrived on the Hyuga grounds, her posture stiff with the effort to keep from drooping over. The events of the morning now, actually, were dragging at her, and all she could think of was her futon, ready and waiting in her room. Even the yellow-brown mud stains at the hem of her robes, bright and pungent as rotten yolk, only elicited the faintest of shudders where once she would have immediately headed for the baths. Instead, the Hyuga went to the room that she shared with 3 other branch maidens, peeling off her clothes with a sigh of distaste as she saw the marks Tora had left upon them. If ever she had regretted being too forceful with the cat, she hadn't. Then the sight of the muddy paw prints and obstinate cat hairs on the once fine white cloth cleared her conscience immediately. Dropping the clothes in the laundry basket, she pulled on a sleeping robe, the sight of her futon filling her with immense gladness as she prepared to collapse on it and just forget about trees and Uchiha and little boys with terrified blue eyes until it was time to get up to meet her team for training. The door clicked open with an urgency belied by the quietness of the motion. Startled, Yuki turned her head and saw Haruka, one of her many cousins, slide around the wood and into the room, blank eyes alive with concern and a fearful curiosity that only a fellow Hyuga would be able to see. Her tone was clipped, composed, but the edge of panic could not be entirely hidden under the polished words. "You must come, Yuki. There is an Anbu inside the compound. He wants you to leave with him, immediately." Yuki let the quilt she had just drawn back fall onto the mattress as she stared at the older girl in confusion. "What? They want you to come right away." They were going to come barging in until Tokuma-kun managed to make them wait for a few moments. Despite her obvious worry, Haruka was obviously indignant at the idea of even an Anbu daring to barge into the Hyuga compound. "You must go to them, at once." Quote, a sharp-toothed creature of terror coiled in Yuki's stomach, sinking its icy fangs into her spine. She could think of only one thing that the Anbu would want to speak to her about, but they surely couldn't think that she had had anything to do with it. No, they couldn't blame her. Words would not come to her open mouth. She could only gesture at her garments, dimly registering in her mind that this was a small thing to think about at this time. "But I'm not even dressed." With a noise of great irritation, Haruka snatched a plain white robe from the open wardrobe, tossing it over Yuki's head. "Just hurry up and pull that on. If they're going to interrogate you, they won't care what you wear." Were it not for the robe muffling her voice, Yuki would have pointed out that she would care, for interrogation by Konoha's famed torture and interrogation force would be bad enough without being in her sleepwear when it happened. However, no sooner was the robe over her head when Haruka seized her cousin by the arm and dragged her out of the room, her grip tighter than steel. "Come on. You're just lucky that Hiyashi-sama isn't in the compound. He'll want to know what happened once he returns, of course, as long as Uchiha Fugaku doesn't keep him for too long." Yanking the robe down, Yuki stared at her cousin, a strange feeling of dread overcoming her. "Uchiha Fugaku, do you know any other?" He was supposed to be at a meeting, but he ignored it for some reason, and the clan heads had to reschedule. Hiyashi-sama was very angry, but apparently the Uchiha elders are worried about something. "What?" Yuki breathed, her anxiety over the Anbu forgotten in this sudden fitting of puzzle pieces. "What are they worried about? Who knows with an Uchiha? It must have been bad though, to risk angering Hiyashi-sama. You wouldn't think they would have the nerve, would you?" "No," Yuki lied. "The Uchiha would surely have to be caught up in something tremendous to risk their chance at playing politics in the weekly clan meeting, but perhaps tremendous was not the word to use about a small child, cowering under a tree that devoured a corpse." She was tired, her mind could be leaping to conclusions, but if Uchiha Fugaku did have anything to do with an attack on Uzumaki Naruto, well, she wouldn't be surprised if he ended up like his kinsman, hanging in the tree. The floorboards of the Hokage Tower were old, and they did not belong in the place they lay. They came from trees that no longer grew, in a country that had long since been swallowed up by grass, and none could remember the name of the floor that produced them, never mind who lay them. But the wood remembered being coaxed from the earth in a spore of luminous gold chakra that fed and grew them in deep, rich earth, surrounded by alien trees, where their kind had never taken root before. They had unfurled from the loam, roots weaving deep into the earth, buds tipping open in a blaze of color, in the span of 3 hours, and 3 hours they had stood before the axe bit deep into them. Choked under the slippery shine of varnish in some places, muffled by carpet and tatami mats in others, the memory of those few hours of sunlight, of a breeze rich with the scent of cherry blossoms and the promise of rain, was still buried in the grains, known by something without a mind. So Naruto had no idea in hell how he knew it. Leaving the hospital after the old man had gone had been a problem, not even because of the stupid nurses that kept telling him to eat his yucky medicine when he told them he felt fine. The plant that had curled around him when the old man was there had been nice in a way, almost like someone was cuddling him, not that he knew what that was like. But then it wouldn't let go of him, even as he scratched and wriggled and called it names that the orphanage staff would smack him for. When he'd finally gotten rid of the stupid thing, somehow with the taste of sunlight on his skin, and he didn't even know how to describe that, one of the people who wore weird masks showed up, and told him that he'd have to go to the old man's office. It was kinda odd, seeing one of those people again. Naruto used to see them all the time when he was younger, 'cause for some reason, they hung around the outside of the orphanage a lot, though they vanished whenever they caught him looking, but now he only really saw them when he went to visit the old man. It was while walking to the old man's office, the masked guy walking really quickly in front of him, that Naruto first realized something had changed. He had always been able to sense something strange, especially around plants, that everyone acted like he was weird for feeling, but it had suddenly gotten sharper, so much that he almost staggered under the new sense of knowing that slammed into his head with the force of a haymaker. The wood was beginning to warp around the edges of the windowsill, where the last memories it held was a small girl with blonde pigtails who had sat there waiting for her grandfather. The floorboards in the main foyer of the building had been set down by 3 teams of genin 12 years before. They had messed around and actually scratched the wood, and the way they'd slapped filler on top of it set Naruto's teeth on edge. The door to the Hokage's office had no nails within it. It had been a living tree, shaped into the entrance as smoothly as if it had grown there itself, and it still remembered the smiling man that had done it. It was driving him mad. To his disappointment, the old man himself wasn't in the office, although there was a mound of paperwork on the desk already waiting on the desk. Instead, there were 2 girls standing in front of the door murmuring quietly to each other. Naruto drew closer, curious to know what they were talking about. The girl on the left, who wore a weird dress that she was clutching tightly to her body, was looking at the old man's desk with a furrowed brow. "Cannot believe they sent Anbu to fetch us. Shouldn't it have been a police member, if they were just fetching us for the Hokage?" The other girl, who had long messy black hair and looked oddly familiar, though Naruto couldn't tell much more from facing her back, shook her head. "I haven't got a clue. They were waiting when I showed up to give up the damn cat back. Just said that the Hokage had urgent business with us, and to head straight to his office, would barely let me stay to collect the furball's reward." "Why, do you think it's about?" Naruto must have made some noise he didn't know about, because both girls spun around, their hands flying to the pouches that were looped around their waists or raised in some half-formed seals. Filled with a sudden terror, kunai flashing in the dark, red eyes staring down at him, Naruto sprang back, reflexes earned by having to dodge angry prank victims serving him now as he prepared to flee. Then recognition sparked as he stared up at the black-haired girl, who had also lowered her hand, looking back with an odd look on her face. The girl next to her, who had rather creepy white eyes like the guys who lived in that fancy compound that the old man had warned him to never prank, didn't remove her hand from her weapons, though she seemed to have relaxed a little. It was Naruto who broke the awkward silence as they stared at each other, offering a smile that was a shadow of his normal cheery grin, but far more cautious. Hi. For a moment, the silence continued, as blue eyes fixed on black. Then the girl, Hiyami, he remembered, that was the name she'd told him before he collapsed without knowing if he'd wake up again, smiled, the first smile that anyone apart from the old man had ever directed at him without doing something mean afterwards. "Naruto, right," he nodded, returning her smile with his normal beam. "Hiyami-chan," she laughed, sounding relieved. "Yup, and that's Yuki-chan." She jerked her thumb at the other girl, who stared at her, eyes narrowed, though it was kind of hard to tell, what with them being close to the same shade as her skin. "Yuki-chan." Hiyami laughed again, this time more nervously. "Ahem, we're glad you're okay." There was. She trailed off, and shook her head. "Anyway, it's good to see that you got out of the hospital." Naruto nodded eagerly. He really didn't like that place. It stank of that stuff the orphanage staff used to clean the floor, and the nurses wouldn't let him get out of bed until the medic nins finally said he could go, even though it was obvious that he was fine. The door opened, and all 3 of them spun around. Standing in the doorway was the old man, dressed in his hat and long white robes. He had a smile on his face, but Naruto could see that he was also looking kinda angry. "But why? I'm pleased to see that all 3 of you made it. Please, sit down." Noting absently that Yuki's eyebrow had twitched violently when the old man said that they had made it, Naruto slid onto the middle of the 3 chairs that stood in front of the old man's desk. Immediately, the knowledge that he couldn't even begin to comprehend rushed into his head. The musical notes of the wind rustling through leaves, the scurrying of small creatures through roots, and how utterly minuscule they were next to a being that had stood for countless turns of the moon. The pain once sheared from the roots, the memory of a hammer and the rough touch of glue, oil, cloth, blood, the scent of so many that had sat upon the seat, that had curled their fingers around the narrow hand rests, whose scent and touch still lingered decades after they had gone. Yuki and Kiyomi sat down more sedately, looking nervous. Naruto didn't know why. The old man was the kindest person in Konoha, and he had always been nice to him when no one else would. I've called the 3 of you here today to discuss what happened last night. I've already heard the story from Naruto, and from some other sources. However, I would like to get all the facts, from every perspective, which is why I called in all 3 of you. He folded his hands, looking from one face to another. Naruto shifted uncomfortably. He didn't want to be reminded of that night, even if it was just the old man asking. The memory of that shadowy man, and that relentless feeling of being trapped, of being hunted, was not something he even wanted to go through again. Next to him, Kiyomi shared a glance with Yuki. There was something off about the Hokage. While both had been born before the Kyuubi attack, they had been too young to remember much of the Yondaime, apart from a few blurred memories that their imaginations had embellished as time went by, until they didn't know what had happened and what hadn't. The Sandaime had been the kindly figure that it seemed had always watched over the village, guiding and protecting them all. Though they had read about his great feats in history at the academy, and had even seen his picture in the bingo book, they had never really thought of the Sandaime as a fearsome ninja who had killed hundreds over the course of his very long career. But now, as they sat in front of the Hokage, with that steely glint in his eye, not to mention the stern look on his face that he was directing at them, they were suddenly reminded that this man had been selected to become Hokage for a reason, and that he was the only person who seemed to care for Uzumaki Naruto in the whole of Konoha. And that thanks to the absolute power the cage wielded, they had a council, but a group of civilian and ninja heads, no matter how important individually, could never trump the Hokage's authority if he ordered someone to be dragged off and interrogated or even executed if he felt so inclined. Then it would be quite easy to scramble up the truth until everything looked perfectly reasonable and justified. Not that the Hokage had ever abused his power in such a way, or at least to their knowledge, which, as genin, were not much, so, yeah, but that was still incentive for the two to begin talking about what had happened on that fated trip into the forest. While making sure to emphasize that they had arrived after the attack had happened, had seen and known nothing about it prior to when they had wandered in, chasing Tora, and had been the ones to bring Naruto back safely, Yuki keeping her mouth shut about how she'd have been happy to leave the child in the forest after realizing that he happened to be suspiciously sitting under a tree filled with a mangled corpse. Naruto didn't listen to the report, both because it was an unpleasant reminder of what had happened, and because it was delivered mainly by Yuki, who, like the rest of her family, had perfected the art of talking in a formal, complicated manner when talking about official business, which was easily understood by the experienced Hokage, but less so by a 6-year-old boy who wasn't even in the academy yet, and her own teammate, who had managed to skip out on a lot of etiquette lessons by virtue of having no chance in hell of ever needing to deal with the other clans on official levels as the real heirs of the clan and those judged promising enough to marry into other prominent ninja families did. But while Kiyomi merely sat there, a cold, clammy feeling creeping over her skin as she watched the Hokage's expression, Naruto instead let his attention sink into the wood around him. If the knowledge itching against his skull had been overwhelming when he hadn't been looking for it, it was nothing compared to what he felt now. Understanding rippled through him, of the hundreds who had sat here, some nervous, some excited, some overtaken with awe, some whose brushing of fingers or feet against the chair had been barely registered. There was the Chunin with long black hair, who had sat so lightly on the seat that the chair had hardly felt her, though it still recalled the way her fingers had dug into its side when she learned that Hitaki Sakuma was dead. Senju Naoki's sunny laugh still resounded through the wood. He had once spilt tea over it and scrubbed frantically to make the stain leave, while Uzumaki Mito sat at her husband's desk, stroking the last thing that he had made before he left her forever. Deeper and deeper he sank, through war reports and nervous genin, through collapsing Anbu and their quiet relatives, the rasp of kunai against leather, the shifting of new Chunin vests against unprepared shoulders, back into the early days, when he had been alive and awake and the shine of his flowers was still there. Naruto felt the burst of warmth under his fingers, felt the stiffening pain of life returning to limbs that had not felt it in so long, in the way his hands had hurt when he came in from the cold. Still, he was barely aware of exactly what was happening, until he heard a crack that cut through the conversation in the air. The Sandaime and Genin froze, staring at the chair Naruto had been sitting on as the hand rest shifted under his fingers, new growths splaying out, splintering through the enamel as they trailed out spindly branches with tiny buds of pale pink and red. Before their disbelieving eyes, the tiny cherry blossom branch swayed towards Naruto, loose petals dropping into his lap like priceless jewels. The boy himself stared dumbly at it, hardly able to understand what had just happened. Suppressing a groan that this had come about again, even as part of him rejoiced in what he knew it meant, Sarutobi gestured for Yuki to continue talking. Looking bewildered, she complied, eventually finishing up with, "And then we brought him to the hospital, Hokage-sama." Sarutobi leaned back in his chair, sternly regarding the girls in front of him, both of whom were still darting gazes at the overgrown chair in their middle. On one hand, their story corroborated with that of the Chunin that they had handed Naruto over to, as well as the boy himself, and they had brought him back safely. On the other hand, the Hyuga had been able to see how the tree had been manipulated to kill the Uchiha, and both had seen proof of Naruto's involvement directly in front of them. If the Hyuga told her clan what she had just witnessed, things could get ugly quite quickly. Although they honored their first two Hokages, the Hyuga had been glad when the clan split anew and gradually lost their cohesive front, freeing up one side of competition for the most prominent clan in the village, but that was without the Mokuton Kekkei Genkei. Previously thought uninheritable, Orochimaru's experiments had proven it could be transmitted through Hashirama's genes, if a weakened form at a terrible cost, not that it was widely known that Tenzo wielded the Mokuton. Sarutobi had no intention of letting the snake know that one of his most prized experiments had in fact succeeded, and certainly Tenzo was not nearly as versatile with the bloodline as Hashirama had been. The Shodai had controlled the very essence of plant life itself, extending to anything that had been formed of that, as Naruto's transformation of his chair had just demonstrated. Sarutobi shuddered to think of the fallout when it was revealed that the pariah of the village held the complete bloodline. And as for the Uchiha's reaction to the news of their old rival's gift bursting anew, the less said about them, the better. Finally, he came to a decision. "I am declaring what you saw to be an S-rank secret. You may not reveal it to anyone, whether a fellow ninja or your respective clan heads, no matter how much they demand the information. If you do, the penalty will be severe. Do I make myself clear?" Both girls had paled drastically, which was saying quite a lot, considering that both were from clans that prided themselves on their porcelain complexions at the barely hidden threat of execution, neither having realized that it was that serious. However, they quickly murmured their assent, knowing that they had no other choice, and Sarutobi nodded. "You are dismissed." Looking relieved, the two got up and headed out of the door, though not without a backwards glance at Naruto on Kiyomi's part. Sarutobi waited until he heard their footsteps fade away, before he turned to Naruto. It was time to explain some of the truth to the boy. Oh, not everything, not the full truth of the heritage that could plunge him into danger if the wrong people could wind of it, but enough so that Naruto could understand, and hopefully be happy about the great gift his genes had bestowed him with. Naruto felt incredibly excited, but also very confused. "I have a Kekkei Genkei." The Sandaime nodded, his eyes flickering up to the portraits of the four Hokages that lined the wall. "And a powerful one at that, Naruto. The Mokuton has only ever been wielded by two others in the history of Konoha, neither of whom were, technically, related to each other. It seems that you are the next." Naruto absorbed this, his blue eyes narrowed. He had always dreamed of being special, of having or being able to do something, anything, that would make the other villages sit up and notice him, and not just walk away while looking at him nastily for something that he didn't understand. But he had never dreamed of something like this. His head was still swimming with the knowledge that had hit him as soon as he woke up, and part of him hated the change, but on the other hand, that guy in the forest hadn't stood a chance against it. And Naruto liked that, he liked that a lot. The first wielder of the Mokuton was our own Shodai Hokage, Naruto. He used it to shape the land that we now live on, and transform it into a place where Konoha could be safe and prosper. The other wielder became a great Anbu and a loyal shinobi of Konoha. Both were powerful ninja. Naruto, if you work hard when you enter the academy, then there is no reason you cannot reach such heights as well. He would have said more about Tenzo, but refrained. As the Anbu, Tora, Tenzo rarely used the Mokuton in battle unless he was certain that he could kill all his enemies, both so that Tora would not be linked to the ordinary shinobi Tenzo, and also so that Orochimaru, who still evaded their spies, would not realize that his experiment had been successful. Naruto could learn about him later. After all, the man was probably going to retire in a few years anyway. Naruto nodded silently. It was true that he liked the idea of being powerful, of being respected, but there was something more. He never wanted to be as he had been in the forest again, helpless, cowering, frightened. He wanted to be able to fight, to be able to defend himself. He would work with this Mokuton, work to become a great ninja, and no one would ever make him helpless like that again.